This week here in America, we celebrate the holiday that we call Thanksgiving. And why we like to talk about a feast that was shared between 53 pilgrims and about 90 Native Americans after the Pilgrims' first harvest in 1621 as being the first Thanksgiving. Of course, the idea of harvest festivals goes back millennia, and setting aside time to give thanks and to share was an integral part of Native American culture long before Europeans ever arrived. In fact, even the idea of Europeans and Native Americans sharing a meal to give thanks long predates the Pilgrims. Spanish explorers shared a feast and celebrated a Thanksgiving Mass with the Timucuan people as early as 1565. And another important figure in the development of the holiday was one of the first European explorers to explore the territory that we now call Canada, Martin Frobisher. Frobisher stumbled upon undiscovered parts of the new continent while he was searching for the fabled Northwest Passage, and some historians argue that a meal that he shared with his crew on what would become Canadian soil in 1578 is the mythical foundation of the Canadian celebration of Thanksgiving. And like all tales worth telling, Frobisher's is a tale of adventure, of heartbreak, of piracy. The curious tale of the life of Martin Frobisher is history that deserves to be remembered. Frobisher was born in the 1530s in Yorkshire, England, to a merchant. His father died early, and he was raised in the household of one of his mother's relatives, Sir John York, another merchant. Frobisher joined the merchant crew of Thomas Wyndham as a cabin boy and was part of one of Britain's first trips to Western Africa and the Kingdom of Benin. There the merchants traded goods like English cloth to the warrior kings for pepper and gold. Unfortunately, on the way back from the successful mission, the crew was struck down by disease and most perished, leaving only 40 survivors of an original crew from 3 different ships. Frobisher was one of the fortunate few to survive the mission. The Portuguese were not pleased by the British incursions into what they saw as their trading territory. A series of papal bulls, called the Bulls of Donation, issued by Alexander VI in the late 1400s, rather arbitrarily divided the non-European world into pieces for trade from the assigned nations, with Africa going to Portugal. Later, Queen Elizabeth I would respond to Portugal's protests about British trade in Africa, saying, "As amongst all princes and countries, the use of intercourse of merchandise is the chief exercise of amenity." And, as the head of the Church of England, she didn't recognize the Pope's authority anyway. The English, the Portuguese, and well, pretty much everybody raided each other's ships on these merchant voyages, and it created an atmosphere of ill will and distrust. In the 1550s, Frobisher joined a new merchant group and returned to Benin. Records of this visit show dates when trades were made and at which locations, but neglect to mention a significant event in Frobisher's life. He was, apparently, used as a goodwill pledge between the merchants and the native peoples during trade, but Frobisher's crew left him behind rather than recovering him. Frobisher was eventually handed over to the Portuguese and held as a prisoner in a fortress on the Gulf of Guinea. Sometime later he was returned to Portugal and from there made his way back to England. In the 1560s, Frobisher stood before the Privy Council and gave a deposition about his 9-month stint as a Portuguese prisoner a decade before. He said during his imprisonment the Portuguese asked him to go collect supplies. Frobisher said that he was required to make diverse journeys that dwelt a mile or two from said castle to get victuals as goats, poultry, and other for to supply their necessity, for that they themselves durst not, for peril of their lives, do it. It's not clear exactly how or when Frobisher got back to England, but historians assume that this was probably a formative experience. He clearly would have felt devalued being abandoned by his fellow merchants and left in Africa, and moreover, in the time that he was in prison, they likely sold all the goods and split their shares without him. So he didn't even get paid for his venture and his imprisonment. But after returning, it appears that he permanently left the household of his uncle, Sir John York, and set out to earn his own fortune. Frobisher married a wealthy widow, Isabel Regat, in 1559 and proceeded to spend her fortune apart from her. Theirs was a marriage of convenience, not love. Though she had children from a previous marriage, Martin and Isabel never had children together. By 1560, Frobisher was an active privateer and was rarely, if ever, home. Privateer was a curious profession, skirting the legal and piratical boundaries at sea. In the time before international law, merchants who had been robbed at sea could apply to the Court of Admiralty for a letter of reprisal, giving them a court-appointed right to retrieve the value of the loss of their property from a countryman of the person who had robbed them. Privateers were supposed to operate within these guidelines, but once away from the shore, things could get rather dicey. Plus, if certain amounts of cargo made their way into the pockets of the port authorities so that they looked the other way, well, limits of the letters of reprisal became less important. It's again unclear when or how Frobisher became a privateer, but he was successful enough to purchase his own ship, the Mary Flower, and continue his money-making enterprises on her. In 1569, Frobisher absconded with wine from an English merchant who wasn't going to let him get away with it. The merchant tracked down his stolen goods and demanded them back from the new owner, who didn't want to give them up, but named Frobisher as the man who had supplied the stolen goods. Frobisher was arrested the next time he came to port and held at the infamous Marshalsea prison until he could pay a fine of £900, which was a huge amount of money for that period of time. The Privy Council wrote to the jailer, "We send upon you by this bearer, Martin Frobisher, against whom you know what grievous complaints have been made, of diverse and sundry piracies by him committed." But Frobisher's smuggling had made him some powerful friends in the court. They petitioned Queen Elizabeth, and Frobisher was released without paying the fine. However, there was a price to be paid. Frobisher was expected to head an anti-privateering force in the name of the Queen and to stop smuggling and piracy where he could find it. He had little success with this assignment, but continued to serve. In 1572, Frobisher helped supply the British while they quelled a rebellion in Ireland, and after that he either began quietly privateering again or once more took up the habit if he'd ever actually quit to begin with. Then his career took a curious turn. Historians aren't certain why, but in 1574, Frobisher petitioned the Privy Council for money and supplies to attempt to locate the famed Northwest Passage, a sea route that would allow British merchants to sail west from the Atlantic to the Pacific Ocean. The pirate, it seems, decided that he wanted to try his hand at becoming an explorer. The Crown declined to fund Frobisher's expedition outright, but two private merchant groups were game, as a Northwest Passage offered enormous potential for trade, and Frobisher was an accomplished navigator. Frobisher set sail in 1576. Queen Elizabeth herself showed her support by waving farewell to his expedition from Greenwich Palace on the Thames. He landed at Labrador and sailed into the bay which was later named Frobisher Bay. Because of stormy weather, he turned aside from sailing further northward and landed on Baffin Island. According to some historians, members of Frobisher's crew were kidnapped by the native people living on Baffin Island, and he was unable to retrieve them on the first or subsequent missions. One wonders if it brought back echoes of his own imprisonment in Africa decades prior. Despite this setback, Frobisher obtained a large rock from Baffin Island that he gave to the merchant corporation when he returned to England as proof of the new lands he had discovered. One of the merchants of the group had the rock analyzed and determined that it contained gold. This energized everyone because now they weren't just talking about a trade passage to the other side of the world, but also gold-rich new lands for the claiming. Following this discovery, Queen Elizabeth helped fund two more Frobisher expeditions, one in 1577 and another in 1578. He sailed back to Baffin Island and brought back tons more of the mineral discovered in the ground there. Unfortunately for Frobisher, the mineral turned out not to be gold, but relatively worthless iron pyrite, or fool's gold. Frobisher's dreams of a gold-covered future were over, and no more expeditions were funded. His tons of iron pyrite were used to pave roads in England. It was during Frobisher's 1578 trip that he supposedly held a Thanksgiving service for the safe passage of his expedition. Thanksgiving services were held in Europe and, as mentioned earlier, by native peoples in the Americas prior to this time, but Frobisher's Thanksgiving was one of the first European observances in North America. It would be more than 40 years before the Pilgrims would feast with the Wampanoag at Plymouth. At Frobisher's Thanksgiving, they didn't have a large meal or other trappings that have come to be associated with later Thanksgiving traditions, but they did give thanks for their lives. With no prospects for another expedition to search for the Northwest Passage, Frobisher secured a position commanding a ship in an expedition to put down a rebellion in Ireland in 1580. And in 1585 was appointed Vice Admiral by Queen Elizabeth, serving under Sir Francis Drake, raiding Spanish ports in the West Indies. He earned fame for his role in driving off the Spanish Armada, sent to facilitate an invasion of Britain in 1588, where he commanded one of the English fleet's 4 squadrons. Frobisher commanded the Triumph, the largest ship in Queen Elizabeth's navy. He attacked the San Martin, the flagship of the Duke of Medina Sidonia, twice, although he was unable to capture the ship. At one point, the Triumph was surrounded by 30 ships of the Armada off the Isle of Wight, but Frobisher demonstrated exceptional skill in seamanship, using the ship's boats to maneuver Triumph, where it could take advantage of the weather gauge upwind of the Spanish and escape. Frobisher was knighted for valor in his role in defeating the Spanish fleet. It was a remarkable achievement for someone who started as a mere cabin boy, and who had been abandoned in Benin as if he were worthless. That same year, his first wife, Isabel, died alone in a poorhouse. She probably hadn't seen her husband for years. By 1590, Frobisher had married another widow, Dorothy, the daughter of the first Baron of Wentworth. But domestic life didn't seem to be his taste, as Frobisher was off chasing Spanish treasure ships, commanding an expedition to blockade the Spanish coast the following year. In November 1594, Frobisher's luck ran out. Leading a fleet during the siege of Fort Crozon, part of the French Wars of Religion and the Anglo-Spanish War, Frobisher received a bullet wound to his leg. The surgeon who removed the bullet failed to remove the cloth wadding, and the wound became gangrenous. Frobisher died November 22nd, 1549, at Plymouth, England. Martin Frobisher was a complex historical personality, a rogue at the time of Walter Raleigh and Francis Drake. He was a pirate or a privateer, depending upon your point of view. He was one of the first explorers to explore the northeast of North America, and a daring soldier who helped to defeat the Spanish Armada. Ships of the Royal Navy have been named after him, street names in Canada, and of course Frobisher Bay on Baffin Island. But he was also a lousy spouse.
I wouldn't have wanted to be married to him. Tomorrow, friends and families across the United States are going to be gathering together to give a traditional meal of Thanksgiving in celebration of each other.
Canadian Thanksgiving is actually traditionally held the second Monday in October, so we've already missed that. But for all of our viewers everywhere, happy Thanksgiving. May you have much to be thankful for. We're thankful for you and all the topics of forgotten history that you send our way. May all of you make history that deserves to be remembered. I hope you enjoyed this episode of The History Guy, short snippets of forgotten history between 10 and 15 minutes long. And if you did enjoy, please go ahead and click that thumbs up button. If you have any questions or comments or suggestions for future episodes, please write those in the comment section. I will be happy to personally respond. Be sure to follow The History Guy on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and check out our merchandise on teespring.com. And if you'd like more episodes on forgotten history, all you need to do is subscribe.